Hello all, Woodwork Geek back here again. This week is a chopping board. It's a cherry and maple basket weave pattern. We start the process by milling down the timber. I take rough sawn maple and cherry wood, run it through the jointer, get two clean straight edges, and then run it through the thicknesser, and then cut it to width on the table saw, and then run that line through the jointer again so that I get PAR or plain all round timber on all four sides. I then resaw the maple to create 5mm strips on the bandsaw. You can see my resaw blade. Key here is to keep the piece of wood firm against the fence so that you get a nice straight cut. That means that when you go through to flatten that cut edge, there's less wasted materials. I typically do two sides, so I'll plane all round. I do the back side and the front side to create two strips. I then use the jointer, as you can see here, to finish up the outside edges again, and then I run them through the bandsaw. That gets me 4 strips around about 5mm. After I've got those strips at 5mm, I'll have one face that will be a sawn edge from the bandsaw. So that those saw edges from the bandsaw I then run through the planer if it's kind of really rough. Once it's gone through the planer, I then bring out the drum sander, and as you can see here, I put a clean bit of sandpaper in the drum sander, and then I run those 4 pieces through so that I get a equal uniform thickness of maple on all 4 sides. Sorry, on all 2 sides. These maple strips are really important in terms of they have a uniform thickness, because they become the outer sandwich, if you like, with the cherry to create the white stripes against the brown cherry kind of blocks on the board. So if these aren't uniform, then in essence all your glue joints will be really difficult to get tight and square. Once you've got the maple dimensioned, it's then just a case of gluing that maple to either side of the cherry, so you end up with a maple cherry maple sandwich. I do 2 lengths here of 1.2 meter length. Those 2 lengths of 1.2 meters, and when I cut 55mm end grain strips, that gives me enough pieces to make 1 chopping board. So obviously the more boards you want to make, the more lengths of 1.2 meter timber you need to kind of do. As you can see here, I use lots of clamps, so getting a good even spread of clamping force across the whole piece is really important. I just scrape down the excess glue, separate the pieces, and a quick sand just to take off any high spots, just so that it's uniform all the way round, so I get nice tight joints. Once I've got the bulk of the stuff off, I just run them quickly, 1 pass through kind of stuff on each side of the drum sander, just to make sure that they're uniform. I then get the jointer out and I run the kind of thin side through, so that I've got a real clean surface on one side of the width, and then they go through the thicknesser so that I get a perfectly parallel side. So this part here is really important in terms of you have to have accurately dimensioned timber. So if you haven't got perfectly kind of dimensioned timber, then when you come to make these squares, they don't fit in correctly. Here I use the cross-cut sledge to trim down each of the 1.2 meter lengths of sandwich timber to around 55mm long. As you can see, it's just a rinse and repeat, creating more and more of those blocks to create the kind of bulk of the infill. This step here is really important. So when you do that trim down to height for the end grain pieces, it leaves little furry pieces on the corners, even though kind of it's a zero clearance sled, and you have to take those kind of rough furry bits off the edges in order to get nice tight joints for the glue up. So this step here is absolutely important. Here you can see I'm just lining up these blocks with the squares to make sure that they're perfectly dimensioned. So one block upright, one block on its side. The two squares on top of each other should be perfectly level with the upright block. So I just put the two on top of each other here, and then I use the finger test. Your finger will be so much more accurate than a measure or anything else in terms of doing this, because you'll just notice the slightest of variation if it doesn't touch correctly. So don't skimp on this step. What I would say is check it at multiple points along that edge as well, those square pieces, not just assume that because it's right at that place that the squares are the same dimension all the way along. Just do belt and braces and check it in 2 or 3 places just to make absolutely sure, because if this isn't right, you'll get compound errors across the whole board, which will spoil the effect. After you've got the squares to the right dimension, you then have to cut them to the right height. So you use the same jig setup to cut the squares so that they're exactly the same height as all the end grain blocks. Make sure you've got enough, is a key thing here. In reality, 1.2 meter lengths is not quite enough. You'll need about 2.5, 2 3/4 lengths in order to get the right amount of square blocks to the rectangular box. Same process as before, denibble the blocks, and then it's lay the blocks into a form just to make sure that all the joints are nice and tight, and just double check that all the furry bits are off the corners of the timber, so that you get a perfectly formed board. Once all the boards together like this, you'll find that you get little rectangles that need to be cut to shape. So what I do is I take a large rectangle, and then I use the same sled set up just for cut to a smaller dimension, which is the kind of same dimension as the squares, and then you just cut them, and you get 3 and a bit out of each large block. So you can see me cutting them there, and then you just slot them around the edge, and that should give you a full rectangular board with very little wastage out the back. So that's 1.2 meter lengths of the large sandwiched kind of maple and cherry bits, around about 3.2, 3.3 meters of the small squares. Should then give you a whole board. So this board measures about 42 centimeters by 30 centimeters, or 16 3/4 inches by 11 3/4 inches. The big rectangular blocks are 77mm by 40mm. The squares are 19mm, and the maple strip, which is included in the 40mm thickness, is 4mm. So that will give you exactly the same kind of shape size board as what I've got here. Take care with gluing. The key here is making sure you've got good glue surface on all areas. Make sure that the ambient temperature is the right temperature for the glue. So I'm in winter here in the UK, so luckily my garage has got some heat in it, so it's okay, but I have been bitten before by kind of it not being warm enough, and then the glue chalks up. You can see here using my clamping jib. So in essence it's a right angled steel jig, and then on 2 sides of that right angled steel I've got the screws that then apply clamping pressure, so that gives me a good clamping force across the whole board. Once the glue's gone off, I then use my sled to flatten one side of the board. So here I just really kind of edge down little by little to get the minimum amount taken off of that board. Once I've got a flat side, I can then run it through the drum sander. So the drum sander will then make sure that that is a properly clean kind of edge, and then once I've done the top edge, I then put it back onto the kind of planed or routed side to then flatten that side again. I use 120 grit in the drum sander. It does take a number of passes. You cannot be too greedy with the drum sander, it will just bind up. After the drum sander comes the Rotax. So I use the Rotax, Festool Rotax sander for the main bulk of the sanding on these boards, and I run through lots of grits, so 60, 80, 100, 120, 150, 180, 220, 320, with water pops on at least 2 of the last kind of grit, so usually kind of 220, 320. I will dampen the whole board down, raise the grain, and then kind of sand off. You can see here I'm using a light to shine across the grain to make sure that I'm getting off all of the kind of lines that the drum sander leaves. So that's a really important step. Here I'm using my sled again to square up the board. You can see me using the kind of right angle just to make sure that I'm cutting in line with the maple strips, so that it ends up with a nice square to the board rather than just having 90-degree corners. I'm using the router here to put a chamfer edge on all the sides, and then I use my handle jig with a straight cut bit just to then put a handle on each side. At this point we're getting towards the end, so this is sanded I think to 150 grit at this point. See on that corner there, I just had a little bit of breakout with on the corner, so I used some CA glue and kind of tidied that up. Here I'm kind of filling any imperfections, so if a gap is less than 1/2 millimeter, I tend to just use glue and sawdust. But for anything that's a little bit more than that, I will then kind of take a chip of the right wood using the Stanley knife there. You can see me sort of kind of edging bits off. I will then put them in so they're orientated end grain on the board with a bit of glue, push them in, then just cut off with a Stanley and then sand off. Here I'm just using glue and sawdust, water pop, and then there's the RTS 400. So I use this for the handles and the edges mainly because it's got a flat kind of oscillation rather than the circular oscillation, so I find for those it works very good. It's also got a square edge so I can get right into the handles, whereas the round pad for the Rotax just won't cut it for getting into those handles. And here's my favourite finish, Osmos. So I use top hole for pretty much all my projects these days. I just find it so easy to apply, it dries quickly, and is food safe, so it's perfect. There was the branding, putting my logo on the sides. I do it on both of the long sides. I use a little jig to get it so that it's centered. So all my boards are made to the same width, they're all sanded the same way, so that little jig just makes applying the branding iron consistent across each one. Last jig here for the feet for the boards. To the feet I use a little rubber feet with stainless steel screws. I just find they're a lot better than the stick-on ones. If you got to this point in the video, well done. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you do like this kind of stuff, then feel free to subscribe. As always, I'm keen for feedback, so if it's good, bad, or something that you like in there, feel free to let me know, and hopefully I'll see you on the next video.